Hi, good afternoon. We're coming to you on Tuesday of Easter week, Tuesday in the octave of Easter. We are at the rectory of Most Holy Trinity Parish in East Hampton, New York. And I'm here with my friend, the pastor of the parish, Father Ryan Creamer. And we're going to continue our discussion about topics around the book, The Pearl of Great Price, which we've been discussing, topics around the Enlightenment and the path of the Church in the modern world, as well as relevant current political and other issues that I think we can agree take their root to some extent in the era that's discussed in the book, which again revolves around events that occurred in Rome in 1798, when revolutionary France invaded Rome and captured Pope Pius VI, which was a moment of great calamity for the Church and sort of a pivot point in the history of the relations between the states and the Church. So we're going to continue a little bit of the discussion today, and Father Ryan's here to lead us and direct us in that. So thank you, Father Ryan.
My pleasure.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, it's like any other conversation we're having.
That's true.
In reading the play, one of the most interesting things that I saw that I would like your opinion on, and it's funny you mentioned the case of the current time and the issues that we have, especially political, that we cannot escape from them, it would seem. In looking at the characters being considered, personality is a great influencer in so many of the cases. My question would be, in your expression of the characters of Pius VI and then Napoleon, how can you speak to the real difference that is there? And I won't stick on personality throughout. My final question, whenever that time may come, will be to completely go beyond personalities. But at this moment, it would seem the personality of Napoleon, as history records him, versus the personality of Pius VI are both very different. How it influenced the expression of the two characters,
Yeah, it's a good question. As I mentioned in an earlier segment, Pius VI was truly a man of the old regime in his younger days, and I think was regarded by people like Napoleon as a worldly character, such that he would be somebody that politicians and generals and so forth could deal with on a practical level.
Right.
And therefore there was an assumption, and Napoleon in some of the literature seems to allude to this. There's an assumption that Pius would be quote unquote reasonable. Be reasonable now. We have to move forward, right?
Right.
You can't hold on to your temporal power or some of these trappings. The way of the revolution is here to stay. It's been triumphant. It's been triumphant in France. It's also been triumphant in Italy, in parts of what up to that time had been the Papal States. We're going to have this sort of democratic ideal imposed on you, and surely you can see that holding out is futile.
Right.
And I think there was a surprise to some degree in the resistance that Pius VI ends up showing as an old man,
Right.
because he if anything he digs in his heels more and resists that whole construct, right? And he does so. I think one of the reasons he does so, and what I think is particularly admirable, is his personality is given to say, however worldly he may have been, or however interested he may have been in the trappings of the princely power of the Pope, he regards himself ultimately as a servant of the Church, such that he's bound by certain conditions and traditions. He's not free to just say, oh, okay, fine, you're right, we won't have a papal states anymore. Because he basically says, I'm not, this is not mine to give you.
Right.
I received this from my predecessor, and it's my job to hand it on to my successor. It doesn't belong to me. I'm not free to waive the temporal authority, and I'm not free to waive the spiritual authority. Those were both parts of the patrimony of the church, and I'm not going to just hand it over to you because you
Right.
say so. Napoleon, of course, is an interesting figure because, at least in this period, he is an exponent of the revolution, but he's less, he's not an ideological zealot
Right.
either.
I wanted to say, I remember you discussed with the editor Pius's position within the church as essentially a moderate as far as the church of its time would be concerned.
Right.
Napoleon is dealing with this branding, basically, of being called an antichrist because of the wars he's waging and the fact that he's no fan of the church, but he's certainly not a super revolutionist,
No.
Robespierre or a Monteilhard or anything
No,
like that.
he's not. And he, particularly in the early period, he realizes that the Robespierres and the Directory revolutionaries have gone much too far. And he regards religion like so many others of that era of the high enlightenment, the sort of Jeffersonian or even Washington in an American context. He regards religion as good, almost necessary. You have to have religion to keep people virtuous and honest. It's certainly not a dogmatic approach. He's not wedded to the creed. But he recognizes that religion can play a good in society. And it just so happens that the religion of his country, of France, is Catholicism. And so that should be maintained because that's part of the national character of the French people. And he's basically a French nationalist, right?
Right.
So it's fine with him as long as it's controlled in its proper sphere. And where Napoleon ends up going off the rails over the course of his reign is in becoming more and more obsessed with completely controlling it and in breaking the power of the papacy in his war with Pius VI's successor, Pius VII. It's not that he doesn't want there to be a pope or want there to be a church. He's not looking to replace Christianity with some other type of religion, but he wants to be in charge of it, and he wants it to be incorporated into his grand system. And over time, I think he becomes more and more enraged because the Pope and the Church will not simply buckle under, and he can't manage to force it to buckle under. And like other moves that he makes and that other crazy people like Hitler will make later on, right? They become more and more and more extreme trying to force the issue, and it ends up bringing them down. And so I think in some ways Napoleon and Pius VI are similar men who just came to two different conclusions. Pius VI remains committed to the political and spiritual vision of the world prior to the revolution. And Napoleon, while not a revolutionary extremist, he accepts as a practical matter that the revolution has triumphed, and now it's just a matter of everybody rearranging their affairs to accept that political reality.
Then in the context of the personalities, I think we can see, I think I drew the right conclusion then. We see with Pius VI, his, even though it was a muted personality to begin with, it does subside to the wisdom of the ages, and he ends up very much in a John the Baptist situation. He must increase, I must decrease, and
Yes.
he too dies in prison.
He does.
Versus the frenzy that is part of the Napoleonic complex that shows the angst that grips modern society. But there it has a real great beginning, the germination in the one man's frustration, especially burdened with power or maybe enjoying it too much. And it's unable to overcome the other personality to the point of running up against the the wisdom of the ages that's there.
And that, I agree with you, yes, that is sort of writ large, the conflict that has played out in Western political history over these 250 or so years. And the church plays its part in that broader drama, which is the continual friction between the wisdom of the ages and the preservation of the traditional foundation, not its complete trashing, right? And how do you allow for appropriate development without destroying the past? And yes, Napoleon becomes more and more obsessed with destroying because he wants to control and have a modern and political ideology imprinted on everything, including Christianity. And here with Pius VI, you see sort of the beginning of the church's full horror at modernity and why the church retreated so greatly and was so skeptical for the next, century and a half about anything associated with political or religious modernity, because of the oppressive and violent history of the exponents of that ideology that they had used against the church. So one of the other points I think that comes out of that that I think is important to make, particularly in the church context, is the church's attitude up through, say, the 1960s, while it's fair to critique it, it should not be critiqued in a vacuum as if it was just something that somebody made up because they didn't like, modern life, or they're just a bunch of stodgy people who like kings and queens or hate the sexual revolution or whatever, sort of irrational motive is often ascribed to them. Yeah. No, there were actually concrete historical events that were calamitous for these people, right, that informed their thinking. And that's, I think, is a hermeneutic, to use the famous term of Benedict XVI, that would be helpful in reviewing where we are and how we got here, to look at it not that the church just became, fussy and closed up its windows just because it wanted to, but because actual historical circumstances caused that attitude to prevail, because it wasn't prevalent before the revolution.
I was going to mention, the fact of the matter is the Napoleonic interference on the Italian peninsula was just a precursor to the liquidation of the Papal States, which completely changed the way the Church viewed itself from the Roman mentality in regards to the world, because they no longer were a political entity other than as one with just a lot of members by happenstance or baptism, whichever you want to think about it.
And I would add that the event that precipitates this book is the murder of this French general Dupont, who's in Rome, and that his death is used by revolutionary France as the excuse to come in and invade Rome. Why did they need an excuse? Well, it's precisely because Napoleon the year before had stopped short of the full liquidation of the Papal States. He left the Pope to rule Rome and its immediate environs, although he did take over parts of the Papal States in Lombardy. So the obsession on the part of the revolutionaries in Paris was to wipe out this political power. They really, as much as they didn't like the spiritual aspects, they also loathed the fact that the Pope was a temporal ruler with this very august connection to, as you say, the wisdom of the ages. His crown dated back 1,000 years. It was the oldest in Europe, right? So it becomes the symbol of the Ancien regime that they must wipe out.
Now, interestingly enough, moving from politics and frenzy and obsession, there is another character who makes a brief appearance who we could say was never so foolish as to be frenzied, nor certainly obsessed with anything other than his own survival and aggrandizement, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand.
Yes.
Here is a great lesson, sometimes a man of the church, sometimes not, and then again, sometimes a man of the church. What is the lesson that, and specifically that he's able to teach in the book, what does that say? Because in a sense, he's a sort of bridge into the modern address of going after the church, or going with it, or whatever it may be, based on the weather, or the day, or the situation.
Well, as you say, he is one of history's great chameleons. And although he does make only a brief appearance here, it's worth for viewers and readers to take a look at his career. It's a fascinating career. He manages to go from a figure of the Ancien regime. He's actually a bishop of the Roman Catholic Church. He then becomes a leading figure in first in the so-called Constitutional Church, which was the Revolution's early attempt to domesticate the church and put it under political control. He joins that fray. Later, he completely leaves the clerical state. He marries, I believe.
Right.
He has some kind of relationship with a woman. I guess it was a marriage.
He had a fruitful family.
Yes, I guess it was a marriage. And he survives through the whole period, all of the different iterations of the revolution. He's around. He's doing something. And when you get to the period in the book, he's the foreign minister. He's the right-hand man of the Directory, right, which is already the third or fourth government in the revolution. And then, amazingly, after the revolution, he's still around, and he's now he's in the Napoleonic government, and he's in the post-Napoleonic governments, dealing with how Europe will be arranged in the wake of Napoleon's defeat. I quote in the book some of his actual writings, where he does in his journal, he does admit that he is a person who loathed any kind of ugliness or suffering, and that his main goal was to be the ultimate, maybe you could call him Machiavellian survivor. He's constantly adapting himself to these various situations, but he is a statesman. He's trying to, I guess in his view, he's trying to serve the public and do this sort of public good. He just doesn't care, which administration in an American context he's serving. He'll serve any administration and carries out his functions at a high level for, 4 decades.
Right.
In incredibly varied circumstances.
Right. The nihilism, essentially, the self-possessed nihilism of Talleyrand, in contrast to the faith, I think, is one that is completely opposed then to that, Napoleonic frenzy that would say it's black and white. It's either got to be one or the other. We see in this unfortunate situation for the church, this, I think, more modern case of saying we can still dance with the church, maybe changing the music and the steps slowly, and we see actually survival happen, because Pius VI is in prison. Talleyrand dies with the last rites in his bed.
Right.
And you place him at a nice spot in the play because he is there to sort of reflect on it as it unfolds, but he's got he has it's a hubris of the soul, but a certain, definitely, confidence of the moment, which I think helps us go beyond personality and understand the lesson that can be learned from this whole exchange. So that would be the basis for my question. Then, what is the lesson for the modernist who's confident but is looking at the exchange with the church and be they someone in the church who is a little bit too modernist, or someone outside the church but maybe a little too interested for their
Right.
modernism. What is the lesson there that comes from the smugness that's part of that self-preservation versus the final lesson that comes from the ultimate result? Because when we look at the very end of it, even now in our time, historically speaking, we know how this has all played out. By the end of the Congress of Vienna, things were very well taken care of.
Yes.
What do you say about that?
Well, there is a smugness. I just, as you're talking, I had read at one point an incident where during the early part of the revolution, where Talleyrand is now a constitutional bishop, I believe it's Easter Sunday, he's called to offer, I think in Paris, or may have been in his own diocese, he's going to offer a solemn pontifical mass, and he basically has no idea what he's doing, right? So he has to have his assistants or whoever, whatever clergy were there, essentially like somebody holding cue cards, right? So it's phony, right?
Right.
It's not real. It's just used because he's at that time, being a constitutional bishop was a good position to have, so he became a constitutional bishop. And so, to see somebody like that when actually confronted with, their most solemn spiritual duty, is completely clueless, is sort of makes the whole thing, kind of a funny farce in a way. But your question, yes, I think it comes back again to your general view, your sort of hermeneutic of the value of tradition and the value of the past. If you are of this, let's call it the Pius VI school, or the school of to which I think I would place myself in the church, you would say that it's hubristic and wrong to just say that the tradition is outmoded or meaningless, or we have to move beyond it or throw it away. It doesn't mean, as we were saying just before we started the recording, in my opinion, that doesn't mean that there's never any development or change. And I think over the long history of the church, there was always a lot of churn and discussion, probably a lot more than there is now, frankly, about theological questions and moral questions. Because people were less afraid, I think, in general, because all of it was done proceeding from the same foundation. It's when you decide that the foundation has to be completely blown up, that there's no or very little value in what came before, that I think that's ultimately modernism, right? And that's when I think things go way off the rails. As I mentioned, Pius VI was a man who said, "This is not mine to give. I don't have the authority to give you the ring of the fisherman," even though they demanded it of him before he left Rome. "This belongs to my successor. It belonged to my predecessor. It will belong to my successor. It doesn't belong to me. I'm really just a guardian of a deposit of faith," right? And that's a very humble attitude that, it doesn't always mean you're going to come to the right conclusions, but it's a good way of proceeding. It's a good starting point. The modernist, inside or outside the church, takes the other view, right? Takes really the view that was germinated in the revolution, which is, wait a minute, all of this is illegitimate and bad and should be wiped out, and anything associated with it is to be at least feared, if not destroyed. And that thinking infected all of political thought in the West, and eventually it made its way into the church too, which, I would, think we would agree with rather disastrous consequences.
Right.
And now we find ourselves in this odd position where it's hard to have any discussion because we're in this sort of endless tug of war over things that have happened in the last 50 years. And what I'm trying to get at with this, by giving some historical perspective, is if you look at the bigger picture, you can see how things happened, and then maybe you'd be a little less afraid to discuss how they should move forward, because your perspective would be broader.
And it's interesting, obviously it's a play, so it needs dialogue.
Right.
But the dialogue between so many of the characters is soldiers talking about religion, politicians talking about philosophy, certain people handling the wrong subjects in the wrong way.
Right.
It's a lot of people arguing about diesel in the unleaded engine, and confusion.
Yes, confusion develops. People making sort of incorrect assumptions, and again associating the past with darkness, ignorance, oppression, as is so often true. People will locate a kernel of truth or an example of something that's bad, and then extrapolate that to indict the entire system. And that a lot of that was going on, and yes, a lot of that is reflected in the dialogue. But interestingly, and I think importantly for the church also now, all of these things are on the minds of these people. The religious question, has to be dealt with, right? The power of the church, they have to reckon with it. And you wonder now if it would have been so important, right? The church may have been hated and attacked, but it was also very relevant. If it wasn't relevant, they wouldn't have been so fussy about what was going to happen to the Pope.
And history does repeat itself. It's another son of a different revolution who asks, how many divisions has the Pope?
Correct. Correct.
And yet still, he's always quoted. People do, by default, seem to have a recourse, even if it is for misappropriation, to the holder of the wisdom that is there. I've found just opening up paper. The strength that comes from the fact that it's an ethereal concept, so it can't be sledgehammered or burned or anything like that. It certainly gives one great hope, even though there's kind of a sad ending to the play.
He comes to a sad end, Pius VI, but against all the odds and against real political and military pressure, the church holds another conclave, and it's on an island off of Venice, and they elect another pope. And that man has his own, that's Pius VII that we've alluded to, he has his own titanic struggles with Napoleon, and he's imprisoned and goes through all sorts of trials and torments. But in the end, he's sort of triumphant. He survives, he outlives Napoleon. He's restored to power. They restore the Papal States, albeit temporarily. But again, those are sort of historical facts, obviously. But what you're alluding to, I think, is the bigger picture that somehow, for all of its mistakes and all the imperfections of these people, and they were imperfect, just as our present leadership is imperfect, just as we are all imperfect. Somehow the church endures.
Right.
Somehow there still is a papacy in the year 2020, which, if you think about it, is a bit shocking because so much of the world would seem to have discarded it as any kind of necessity, and just its whole history and all the trappings with it and so forth are so antithetical to the spirit of our age. Yet it's still there, and it's still of this inestimable value, regardless of the present, whoever holds the chair of Peter for any one period of time. You couldn't get rid of it if you wanted to today.
As history has shown.
As history has shown, yes. So, I hope you found this discussion interesting. We hope to bring you more content, particularly during this sad time of separation. I think it would gives Catholics and other people interested in how these historical events affect our present situation something to think about. And thank you for joining us, and Father, would you give us your blessing?
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure to talk. It gives something to pray about. Through the intercession of Our Lady of Prompt Succor, may the blessing of Almighty God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit descend upon us all and remain with us forever.
Amen.
Go in peace. Alleluia, alleluia.
Thanks be to God. Alleluia, alleluia.